we're going to have a round of applause for Premier Helen Zille, who will address us now this morning.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Thank you very much, Minister Beverly Schafer, and all my colleagues, Mr. Joseph, Mr. Gabir, and many other people who've been involved in this. Ian Merrington, very nice to see everybody here today. All the blockheads, I suppose, you know. It's really great to meet a whole lot of new people who all look as if they've just left school. But for me, everybody looks young, so that's a very interesting challenge. I'm sure people get cleverer every generation, I have no doubt about that. I'm delighted to be able to give a keynote address. The good thing about giving keynote addresses is that you learn a whole lot more about subjects that you had no clue about before. The bad thing is that you know that everybody in the room that you'll be speaking to knows a whole lot more about it than you do. And of course, that feeling I have on steroids today. Because indeed, what I knew about blockchain was positively dangerous, and I have spent the entire weekend reading up on it, trying to understand it, and of course now I am all revved up because I see the extraordinary horizons and the possibilities to which this technology can be put. Now, as it happens, quite coincidentally, this afternoon I have to appear in the legislature at the Portfolio Committee to speak to my budget appropriation, and to look at what we're going to be spending our money on. And a very significant amount of the budget is going towards our digital governance strategy. And we describe that as managing the availability, usability, integrity, and security of our data assets. Now, after my blockchain reading and going into the preparatory meeting yesterday for the discussion in the Portfolio Committee this afternoon, I realized that our data governance roadmap and our digital governance roadmap would have to be entirely overhauled because it projects our current systems into the future, and it has absolutely no mention of blockchain and its applications. And certainly there isn't a hint of a reflection of understanding how this revolution of blockchain can transform our systems and our processes. And yesterday in the meeting, I said to my colleagues, but you know, well, where's their mention of incorporating this great new technology, blockchain, into our digital strategy, our digital governance strategy? And most of them hadn't heard of it, or had heard of it, but knew less about it than I did, believe me, by that stage. And I said, well, are you all coming to the conference tomorrow? And they didn't know about the conference, which got me really, really sad. So I have to tell you that this is the first of many, because I'm now so seized with this and so seized about the potential that this can be for all the blockheads, but there are many of us who need to be incorporated in this discussion so that it can be embedded in our strategies and embedded in our budgets to be made a reality. And that is one of the things that I'm going to be saying off script in the Portfolio Committee this afternoon. So I've said that we've got to redo this roadmap, and we've got to understand and incorporate the potential of blockchain to revolutionize our systems. Now, our government is certainly on the cutting edge of data governance in South Africa. But what I have now realized, thanks to being asked to give this keynote address, it has brought me to the realization that we are facing a major fork in the road. And if we don't incorporate blockchain and follow its direction, not for the sake of following it, but for the sake of what it can achieve, we'll be following the wrong roadmap. And I have been reading a lot about the early adopters, India. Fascinating that a country of so many people can be pioneering the use of blockchain in digital identities that a person creates themselves and doesn't have to wait for a government bureaucracy to recognize that they exist and register them. Absolutely fascinating. To Estonia and Malta, which is right on the other end of the extreme from India, a very small country, 440,000 people on a rock in the Mediterranean, if JP Fabry will excuse me. And what they have done, using their competitive advantage of a small size and a limited market to harness blockchain. So from India to Malta, two completely different countries, visionary governments understand the application of this technology in their specific circumstances and get ahead of the game. And so I was really fascinated by what we could learn from those extremes, and also from a place like Estonia, which would not be the place we would normally look at as a kind of role model for progress in good governance and in digital governance. Now that I've got all of these great inspirations all around, I realize I've only got 9 weeks left in office, and that we as a government haven't even put our toes in the water yet. But I'm absolutely determined that by the time I leave office, we'll at least have both feet wet, and that the tide will be rising. The tide will be rising. Now, we work in our government on the basis of roadmaps for everything, and we don't even have a GPS for this particular thing. It's in virgin territory, as I said. But in 10 years from now, blockchain will be mainstream. I have no doubt about that when I read about its potential. And how to prepare for that? Very few people in the private sector, especially startups, understand how difficult it is to innovate in government. How difficult it is to introduce fundamental changes of systems and processes in a large government bureaucracy. Yes, we're always restructuring, but we're always restructuring around the old processes and trying to make them more efficient. Blockchain is a revolution of process and systems, and that is what makes it incredibly challenging for government, because you've got to think and do things in a new way, and you've got to challenge vested interests, and that makes it profoundly disruptive. So it couldn't be more timely to have this conference here in Cape Town, and I would like to thank the organizers very, very much. Is it Bitcoin events? I'm always very nervous about conflating Bitcoin with blockchain, because believe me, I do understand the difference. And now that we've got Safcoin in this room, I'm even nervous about mentioning Bitcoin. But nevertheless, to Bitcoin events, thank you very much indeed for organizing this, because it did give me the opportunity to read a whole lot of things that I wouldn't otherwise normally have read. Now, it has taken me some time as a layperson to grasp the concept of the blockchain and the total genius and innovation behind the concept of a decentralized and distributed ledger or database of information. And it took me even longer to get my head around the fact that that would increase trust in the system and not decrease trust in the system. I mean, our entire culture and mindset in our country, and I'm sure every other country in the world, was that your stuff is safe when it's locked up in some central point and only one person has the key. That's why the thing that a bank vault exists. You go and stick it in there and you've got the key and only your bank manager and you can access it. That's security in our understanding of the term. Suddenly people are telling me that something that is visible to thousands of people, even potentially millions, is more secure. How can that possibly be the case? And now I understand that at some point in societies, you lose confidence in the central repository. You can understand why people lost confidence in the banking system in 2007, 2008. You start losing confidence in the infallibility of the central repository. And the genius of the blockchain is that it records every single transaction, especially when it's linked to a financial transaction, but not only. And every one of those forms a block that can never be changed. So the record is there. And each block links to the next block, and you can create new blocks, but you can't change old blocks. And everybody, through complex mathematical algorithms on computers, can check and verify the accuracy of those transactions. Now, that is really genius. And of course, I've been asking a lot of questions around, well, can't somebody put the wrong transaction in? Or if you're using an identity system on the blockchain, can't you create 2 or 3 identities? I don't quite understand the answer to that, but one thing I have been told is that because all of the computers are checking on the accuracy of every new block all the time, in order to overpower and overcome the accuracy checks, you would have had to have more computing power than the rest of the blockchain put together. And the cost of that is so high that it is virtually impossible to do that. So that is absolutely fascinating to me, to have this distributed, decentralized ledger that everyone can read, not all the information, because the information in that block is encrypted in different ways to enable different kinds of people to read different things and different amounts of things, but the critical stuff can be checked, and it prevents fraud and corruption. Now, you can imagine what that does to entire systems all over the world, especially when people are losing confidence in the central repositories. And if I can say that there's one thing about South Africa, it is that we have lost and are losing confidence in the central repositories. Now, the best way I started understanding about blockchain was to read about its applications. And the first application I read about was in Georgia, in Eastern Europe. Now, that's not normally a place that I would look to as a role model for government. But I was fascinated by looking up Georgia in Eastern Europe and see that they've put their entire registry for land on the blockchain. And the result is that if you sell your house, it takes 10 minutes. Now, I've just sold a house, I think, in November last year, and we're about to go into the transfer process. You can do it in 10 minutes. And the reason is that all the verified information is on block A, and if you want to sell it to block 4,720,000, that information changes, the key to the block changes, all verified as legitimate and accurate, and the money transfer has taken place. Done. 10 minutes. For cars, it's 2 minutes. Somebody said 1 minute this morning. Now, that is because every single piece of land has its own block with all the critical information in it. And when you sell a block, you basically sell the key to the block and all the encrypted information on it, and everybody knows that that is secure and safe and genuine. Now, think of our own deeds registry. We've been doing a land audit in South Africa for 10 years. We still haven't come up with the answer, and that is primarily because there's been a lot of fraud at the central deeds registry, and property has been changing ownership in mysterious ways. And especially government-owned land, because government doesn't know what land it owns. Believe me, we battle enough to find out what land we own in government. Government doesn't know what land it owns, and so mysteriously it can suddenly end up in somebody's private ownership by a swap in the deeds registry. Now, I've grown up to believe that the deeds registry is kind of like the Bible. You believe what's there. But if you can't do that anymore, obviously something like the blockchain becomes incredible. And for us, the very first thing I think we should do is put our title deeds registry on the blockchain. Then people would understand that their information is absolutely secure. It would be very interesting to see how you would marry expropriation without compensation in the blockchain. I haven't thought that far yet, but certainly to get the register of title deeds onto the blockchain seems to me the best way to explain to people how it can work and how secure this kind of chain can be. So, a blockchain, as I understand it, and using that example, is ideal for verifying information at scale and linking relevant and complex data with financial transactions. And the mathematical algorithms can also determine what information can be seen by whom and when on the blockchain. This enables new blocks to be started, but no one can change the information on an old block. That is critical to understand, that no one can do that. So the entire history of the transactions are there, as I've said before. Now, of course, when I understood this, my mind started racing with new applications. Can you imagine running our tender system on the blockchain? Every bid would be a block. People could bid on the blockchain, and by the deadline, every bid had to be in. Critical data could be released from the various blocks and compared so that it would be very impossible to do dirty dealings in dark rooms to pretend that certain connected individuals had won the tender. Can you imagine doing tenders on blockchains? It takes away the need to trust government adjudication and evaluation systems. And you can imagine the huge resistance to that in a system which relies on connected governance in a way that we don't like to speak of connectedness. So I think that's another area where we should really profitably look at, especially pioneering in the Western Cape, is putting government tender systems onto the blockchain. Then there's no need for trust in how the government's going to evaluate your tender, because the entire chain can evaluate and judge whether it was a fair process and a fair evaluation. I've not yet worked out how the blockchain introduces some sense of qualitative assessment, but anything with a quantitative comparative requirement is very easily done on the blockchain. I understand that. Now, another fascinating thing is when you tie up the uses of blockchain with other forms of technical innovation, such as, for example, the Internet of Things. And one article I read about the blockchain said that a vehicle leasing company was able to make sure that people paid their leases on time because of the connection between their computer database, in which each lease was a block on a chain, and then linked to the internet, through the internet to the vehicle itself. And if your payments aren't up to date, you can't switch on the vehicle. And I thought, well, that's an interesting application. Obviously, the car is part of the Internet of Things, and the blockchain, from a distance, can determine whether your block is ticked, as it were, on the payment issue, and if it isn't, you can't switch on your car. Now, I thought that was ingenious, and I obviously immediately thought of how we apply that at scale. Now, can you imagine if we as a government could require people to fulfill their personal responsibilities before they went out and splashed their money on things that they don't have to? And of course, immediately the first thing I focused on was child maintenance. We have a massive problem in South Africa of parents who don't pay child maintenance. Massive. In fact, 62% of children in South Africa who registered at birth are registered father unknown. Now, if we had every single court order became a block on a blockchain. So every single court order against a maintenance defaulter became a block on a blockchain, linked to a person's bank account or financial records or whatever it was. Just like you can switch off the ignition of the vehicle, you could well switch off the capacity to pay for anything else that you want until you've paid your child maintenance. I'm sure that's possible on the blockchain. And it's something that I really believe that we should look at seriously, because then you wouldn't get parents spending their money on all kinds of lavish things and neglecting their children, which we do have in South Africa. And I do think that it is a government problem, a massive government problem, because the government eventually has to pick up the problems that result, and more than that, often child grants and other things don't get spent on the children, they get spent on the objectives of irresponsible adults. So you can see how I've been thinking about the applications of blockchain. And then, of course, we've got an election coming up on the 8th of May, And I was fascinated last night to learn that there's a little town in Switzerland called Zug, which means train, interestingly enough, in German. And they are a little tax haven. They want to be the world capital of blockchain. They'll have to catch up with Malta if they have to do that. And they allow people to pay for things in cryptocurrency. Anyway, democracy in Switzerland has regular referendums, as you know. And there, they did a pilot, a test run for a referendum using the blockchain, and they declared it a massive success because it really enables you to vote, to trace that vote, not the person who voted, but to trace that vote from the beginning to the end so that no fake votes can be added to the system, no ballot boxes can be stuffed, the thing can be perfectly reconciled, and everybody can see the result and the reconciliation of the votes. So it takes away rigged elections. So we never have to, for example, risk the path of going the route of Venezuela with rigged elections and rigged election outcomes. If we're on the blockchain, we know that an election was free and fair. And that has fantastic applications in our context, as you can imagine. Now, there's a downside, of course, to that, because currently voting is so complex that we get a public holiday on election day, but we wouldn't be able to do that if you could basically send a WhatsApp and vote. We wouldn't get the extra public holiday, but I think the upside is worth the downside. Now, of course, this kind of thing makes life simpler, much simpler for all. But getting there is mind-bogglingly difficult, mind-bogglingly difficult. I've just tried to introduce an e-learning game changer in government, which many people call a low-hanging fruit. Our president said we'll just give a tablet to every child and solve the education crisis. He didn't quite say that. I'm just elaborating slightly. But when I see what we've been through to get the e-infrastructure, the connectivity, e-teachers, as we call them, e-training, e-content, e-administration, and an e-culture, most challenging of all, it's going to take years and years to embed this new approach, even though it makes it so much easier for people at the end of the day. Switching systems, when people are entrenched in systems and when there are vested interests in systems at scale, is an enormously difficult thing. And in the private sector, it happens so much more quickly because your market and your individual customers have an interest in making their life simpler and easier. At scale in a bureaucracy, that isn't so. And that is why when poor people rely on government systems to deliver, they always fall further and further behind because middle class and richer people can rely on a market that doesn't depend on this huge bureaucracy getting ahead of the change and making it happen. And that is our great risk in government, that we don't keep up with these digital revolutions, and the poor suffer most because they rely primarily on our services. So that is where I came into contact with this idea of the sandbox, which I think is a brilliant concept, sandbox. Now, anyone who's got a grandchild like me knows that you have many hours, lovely hours, in the sandbox with the little molds and the shapes, and you build castles and you knock them down and do all of those sorts of things. It's basically experimenting. It's making things, breaking things, fixing things. And this is a notion I really have to introduce in government in the last 9 weeks that I'm here. In our government, we are allergic to innovation. We are allergic to change, because the entire way we are monitored and evaluated is whether we are implementing old regulatory systems to the letter. So we are thinking of ticking boxes, not on building new blocks. And if there isn't an established protocol for something, you can't do it because the Auditor General won't find that he can tick boxes down a protocol and you will get a qualified audit. So the entire governance and evaluation system militates against innovation, militates against new ideas, because new ideas requires experimentation, and experimentation means you can make a mistake. And so the notion of cordoning off bits of government to create a sandbox in which experimentation is welcomed and allowed is a really brilliant idea. And it is something that we must discuss with the Auditor General, and almost like a special economic zone. You get a sandbox in government where you can do things inside that sandbox that you wouldn't be allowed to do outside the sandbox. Now, the sandbox is going to be a fantastic place for the private sector and the public sector to come together to solve big public problems. And it can almost be like a kind of permanent hackathon where we can put the problems to you, you can come up with ideas, and then we can understand the regulatory environment that is required in order to facilitate the implementation of these ideas. Now, this is what I really got from an interview that J.P. Fabry did on the radio. He's sitting over here. He's from Malta, and I was reading and listening to everything I could about the blockchain, and I heard, wow, here's an interview with somebody on the blockchain, and he's actually going to be at this conference. And I listened to what he was saying, and the most interesting thing that he said was, Malta is a world leader in blockchain because they got the regulatory environment right. Now, that sounds almost counterintuitive because our regulatory environment gets in the way of so much innovation. Gets in the way of so much innovation and all the red tape. So my intuition tells me we need to get away from a regulatory environment. What J.P. Fabry was saying on the radio was, you've got to get ahead of the regulatory environment. You've got to say, this is a trend, and it means a government to spot the trend and to have people who are clever enough to see the way the world is going and not to go around the old digital governance systems, but understand blockchain, for example, and then say what regulatory environment is required to facilitate this, to create a context for this, to get behind it, but get in front of it at the same time and make it work. And Malta got that right. They first got it right with gaming. When everyone was saying, no, you can't touch online gaming, they say, this is going to be a big thing. Let's get the regulatory environment right. And then all the companies came along invested in Malta, and ran their headquarters from there. And they've done it in a range of other industries, which is why they've got the highest economic growth in Europe and the lowest unemployment rate. But what they've understood is you've got to get out in front, get rid of the old regulations, and create a facilitative regulatory environment that creates policy certainty so that investors know what to expect, know what the parameters are, and know that the government is going to be doing that facilitatively in a way that builds trust. Now, the very basis of blockchain is trust. But on its own, it isn't enough. You need trust in a regulatory environment and a government who understands what's going on. And you need trust that the parameters are there and that everyone knows what they are and that you can operate within them. And this is what we, more than anything else, need to do. But we are completely under-equipped to do it. What kind of regulatory environment, for example, would most facilitate the movement onto the blockchain of many, many major private sector functions, not to mention government functions? So there's a lot to think about. And I think we need to have a game changer that focuses on nothing else but thinking about how to create the regulatory environment that will help us get ahead of this mainstream technological revolution that is really going to change the way the world works. So thank you so much for inviting me here today, for getting these insights, for understanding vaguely why and how these things can change, and for understanding that this partnership between the private sector and government is there to build an environment of trust so that every citizen can be secure in knowing that they are being honestly serviced in a way that facilitates their opportunities to advance in life. Thank you very much.